Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our webinar titled Afghanistan Refugee Crisis: How can Australia help? My name is Bilal Wahid and I'm the director of Massoud Foundation Australia that brings this panel to you this evening. Before we begin, the Massoud Foundation Australia acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country throughout Australia and recognize their continuing connection to land, waters, and culture. We pay our respect to their elder, past and present, and extend this to those Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. The Massoud Foundation Australia is an Australian non-profit organisation fostering an enduring relationship between Australians and people of Afghanistan with a strong focus on promoting cultural awareness, education, both in Australia and Afghanistan, and humanitarian and charitable efforts to support the most impoverished people in need of help. Since the crisis in Afghanistan, this is our third webinar this year. We have conducted multiple face-to-face events in the past before the pandemic lockdown hit Sydney. As we are all aware, on the 15th August 2021, Taliban seized control of Afghanistan, except some parts of Panjshir province and Andarab district, where the people are still resisting. Almost immediately, international media outlets reported that thousands of people in Afghanistan were left scrambling to Kabul Airport in a desperate attempt to board some of the last remaining flights out of Afghanistan before the Taliban blocked any chance of escape. We will never forget the images of people falling from planes risking their lives, or young children being passed over brick walls to supposed safety by their parents, not knowing if they will see them again. During this difficult time for the people of Afghanistan, Australia evacuated approximately 4,200 people, and at this stage, the government has committed to resettling a further 3,000 people at a minimum from within the existing humanitarian program quota. The Prime Minister described the figure of 3,000 places as the floor and not the ceiling, and that they would be aiming for a much higher figure than that. The Prime Minister also added that if the government needed to increase the overall size of the humanitarian, it would. However, any further commitment is yet to be announced. Considering Australia's involvement in Afghanistan in the past 20 years and the existing humanitarian crisis brewing in Afghanistan, is the target of providing asylum to 3,000 people from Afghanistan enough? In this webinar, we have invited experts from different national and international organizations to answer this question. I would like to introduce you to our moderator for this event, Dr. Thom. Dr. Thom has worked as Amnesty International Australia's Refugee Coordinator since May 2000, working on behalf of individual asylum seekers as well as a broader human rights issues relating to refugees. In 2000, Dr. Thom completed his PhD at University of Sydney's Department of Government. He has visited detention centres in Australia, including those of Christmas Island, in refugee camps and detention centres in various countries. Over the last 11 years, Dr. Thom has represented Amnesty International at annual tripartite consultations on resettlement in Geneva. Over to you, Graham. Thank you.
Thank you, Bilal, and a big thank you also to the Massoud Foundation for hosting this very timely forum. This is 2 months since the fall of Kabul, so I think, yes, this is incredibly timely. I would also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting. I'm on the Camaragal lands of the Eora Nation here in North Sydney, and I too would like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are watching us tonight. This is a very important forum given the speakers that we have too. We have 3 very prominent speakers today who will be grilled by myself. And we also are very lucky to have Shakufa Takiri here as well, who will provide some closing statements. Bilal has outlined what the Australian government response has been so far. I think this needs to be put in the context of the response from, say, the Canadian government, which has offered 40,000 resettlement places. The UK was quick to offer 20,000. The US has also created a special category of people and plans to resettle tens of thousands of Afghans in response to the crisis. So how is Australia's response measured up to our international partners and also those who also participated on the ground in Afghanistan over the last 20 years? Tonight we have Paris Aristotle, CEO of the Foundation for Survivors of Torture and Trauma in Victoria, but he importantly is also one of the co-chairs of the advisory panel on Australia's resettlement of Afghan nationals, which was set up by Minister Hawke. He is co-chair with Alison Larkins from the Department of Home Affairs. We will also be hearing from Nooria Mehraby. Nooria Mehraby MD is a senior clinician and clinical trainer at STARTS here in Sydney. Herself a former refugee, Nooria has more than 30 years of experience working with refugees, both overseas and in Australia, including 25 years with STARTS, which is very impressive, given the amazing work that STARTS does. And finally, we have Paul Power, CEO of the Refugee Council. He's been CEO since 2006. This is the national umbrella body on refugee policy. He helps lead NGO advocacy with the Australian government and also at the United Nations. So a partner in crime at the annual tripartite resettlement consultations with Paris over many, many years. So welcome everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to have the three of you here speaking with us tonight. And yeah, I'd like to start with Nooria. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Salam everyone and good evening. It's my great pleasure to be here tonight, and thanks to Massoud Foundation for inviting me to be a part of this important panel, and thanks Graham for your kind introduction. So I have some slides, so can I have, Matthew, can I have my slides please? As we know, over 40 years of long-standing conflict and war in Afghanistan have left Afghans lost and exhausted, resulted in millions of Afghans civilian and military casualties, millions of disabled, millions becoming refugee around the world and internally displaced. But also it changed the whole infrastructure and fabric of the society. And currently, it is a humanitarian catastrophe that we're facing. So war is not something new for Afghans, but the current circumstances in Afghanistan has been described by Afghans as the worst of the worst, and one of the most painful and traumatic experience that they have ever experienced. So can I have my, like in this, I'm going to talk about briefly about the impact of this war on Afghan refugees on different level, like on individual, family, and community level. And then also I'll talk about how we are providing our service to support Afghans in this difficult time. So on community level, Afghan communities like feeling betrayed, angry. There's a lot of resentments in the community towards Australian government, but also towards the coalition, because they don't understand what happened. Like basically, what was the whole purpose of spending trillions of dollars, like over 150,000 Afghans were killed, or civilians were killed, and many coalition troops were killed. But also, what was the point of this war? That to replace Taliban again by the Taliban. So, and also the history is repeated, and if Afghans feel that they are betrayed by international international or words, international or people who were involved in the war against the Taliban, and feeling of helplessness and hopelessness. And also it's kind of even Afghan community is divided across linguistic, religion, political opinion, and different ethnic groups. And but also, as it happens with superpowers, this in the last 40 years, superpowers had enough time to divide and rule. So they divided and ruled Afghans within those lines, which resulted in tension and conflict within different ethnic groups. However, in regards to the Taliban, most Afghans are united against the Taliban, but unfortunately, there are a group of Afghans that they are supporting Talibans. So most Afghans consider this specifically taking down or replacing Afghan flag as an attack to Afghans' pride, dignity, and identity. At the level of family, Afghans are coming from a collective culture. So our family is not our only nuclear family, but extended family all around the world. So they're globally contacting with their families. While it's good for them because they're grieving together, but on the other hand, they're exchanging highly traumatic news and materials with one another that can further distress the families. But also here, this can create tension between family members, sometimes conflicts, and concern about families overseas to support them financially while they're under financial stress themselves. But also, we can't send money at the moment. Banks were closed, but also it's hard to send money because they don't give enough money to like in the banks. There's not enough money to distribute it to people, even if we send. And people can't trust also Taliban. And at the same time, we're in the worst circumstances of COVID here in Australia, and specifically in Sydney. Because of that, we have homeschooling. This week was a bit easier for us. But that because of that, children are at home, so they're also dealing with the trauma or distress of their families and their parents, but also they're dealing with their own feelings. So because of that, it further affects children and their learning, concentration, and functioning as schools. And also it's affecting the adolescents and younger generation with different way. Some adolescents they don't want to do with anything with Afghans because it's kind of, they don't want to be named as Afghan because they don't want to be linked with the Taliban or be perceived as Taliban, while others, they are more active and they are campaigning against the Taliban in social media. Even second and third generation Afghans are doing this. So it's different reaction. And then at individual reaction, of course, Afghans were shocked and disbelief and numb as the rest of the world because we didn't know what happened, that the country was, or Kabul was occupied overnight by the Taliban. And obviously it triggered their past trauma, so they present with symptoms of PTSD, flashbacks, recurrent thoughts, and they're hypervigilant. And but also it's a lot of fear. It's a lot of fear for their loved ones, for the family that they are in Afghanistan. They're grieving. They're grieving for those who they had lost, but also it's an anticipated grieving. What would happen to their loved ones that they're stuck inside Afghanistan? So that leave them with feeling of being helpless and hopeless in the circumstances, and sadness, and extremely anxious. Actually, anxiety is highly presented amongst Afghan, and sleep problems. And it's not only because of their PTSD, anxiety, and depression symptoms, but also because there's like literally they're awake until late night, so they can catch up with different time zones with their family members who are scattered around the world, or they're in Afghanistan, or watch different news channels as well. And also most Afghan consider this like again like an attack to their identity, because it's very hard for Afghans to be identified or linked to the Taliban. They don't want to be identified with a group of terrorists. So these are the main presentation or summary of the presentation. So how we help Afghans, and then will get me to my next slide. Can I have my next slide, please? So historically, Afghans around 7,000 Afghans have received services from STARS. Currently, we have 603 people receiving service from us. So next slide, please. As you can see, August and September and October is the highest rates of our referral. The orange ones are Afghans who are already residing in New South Wales. So they're, and also some of our ex-clients re-referred themselves to us. The yellow or the orange ones are, the purple ones were people who are already residing, and the orange ones are those evacuees that they referred to us. Next slide, please. So STARS work holistically. We provide services for individual, family, refugee community, and mainstream Australian society. And my next slide. So at individual level, counseling is a new concept for many Afghans. So we didn't have counseling system or concept of counseling in our culture. So, but still, I mean, those who are referred to us by providing culturally appropriate service to us in engagement and kind of emphasizing on our non-judgmental attitude, that we are with them and not against them. So they are engaged in therapy, and they're willing to explore the depth of their suffering, and they get appropriate support from us. So at the moment, we are giving priority to Afghan clients. We are providing assessment to those who are already residing in New South Wales, but also we're providing support who are residing in New South Wales, but they're the evacuees. So for evacuees, we're providing psychosocial support of assessment 1 to 3 sessions. So basically, we're assisting their urgent need with that, and then also, we're prioritizing and their urgent need. We're providing appropriate referral, and if it's needed, any crisis intervention. If they want to continue with counseling, and if it's needed, we will continue doing it. But if they don't, we will have a follow-up session or a follow-up call in 3 months' time. At the moment, most of evacuees, I'm a part of this assessment team, most of the evacuees are grateful that they're settled in Australia, and they're more into practical stuff. And it's a lot of services that approaching them. Sometimes they get confused about this, so it's kind of the main concern is their concern about their family members that they're in Afghanistan. So, but from our experiences, when people are settled later and when they're feeling safe enough, their symptoms may arise. So that's why we will contact them in 3 months' time. But if they need support now, we will continue seeing them. Next slide, please. In terms of community, STARS has got a strong foundation with Afghan community since it was established. So based on that foundation, we have been in consultation, in partnership with Afghan community, of course, with different ethnic groups, in providing advice on organization, on different things like media engagement and different lobbying, advocacy on their behalf, providing them with trainings and linking them with influential people so they can raise their voice, they can raise their concern, and they can get support. In addition to direct work with Afghan community at all those levels that I've mentioned, also we work with mainstream Australian society. As you know, it's a lot of referrals specifically in the with legal system with solicitors, immigration lawyers, and immigration agents, but also Red Cross and other agencies and schools. They receive a lot of referrals, and they're exposed to all these traumatic materials. They're at risk of vicarious traumatization, and that's why they need support. We provide them with debriefing and self-care sessions and provide them with support, and so they can support Afghans. So my next slide. In conclusion, current crisis in Afghanistan has had significant impact on Afghans residing in Australia through a holistic biopsychosocial approach. STARS has provided support for Afghans at individual, family, and community level, and of course, using an integrative clinical and community development approach. Afghans are incredibly resilient, proud, and dignified people who are not willing to give up even in worse circumstances. So we trust this time will pass too, and we will see smiles on the face of beautiful Afghan girls like this beautiful Afghan girl. So my next slide, please. Here, this is a message for my Afghan fellow Afghans. So I know we are tough. I know we don't reach out for help that easily, but it's okay not to be okay, and it's okay to reach out. So if you need support, please contact us. This is our contact details. We're here to support you, and we're willing to do so. So please do so. And the last slide shows my direct contact details, and please contact me if you need. So once again, thanks very much to Massoud Foundation and all the panels. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Mooria. From somebody who's had 20 years of working with both Starts and also Foundation House in Victoria, I can't speak highly enough of the amazing work that you do for people who have suffered torture trauma. And I think what we've seen coming out of Afghanistan, what we saw at the airport, was absolutely horrific. And I literally just had a message come up on my screen that one of the families that we help sponsor with the help of Refugee Legal has just landed in Melbourne, which is great news. But their stories of how they escaped and how they were tried to get to the airport on a number of times and was pushed back. You can understand the trauma that people have faced, and again, the work that your organisations are doing are absolutely amazing. So we might come back to that, given the recent announcement by the Minister and the support that's going to be provided. But I did want to start with you, Paris, just to talk a little bit around what the advisory panel is that you are co-chairing. Because obviously that was set up very quickly by the Minister. It contains both experts, professionals, but also members of the community, and has had some really important work to do when it comes to Australia's response in the last few weeks. And I know you've been extremely busy. So maybe if you'd just like to give a little bit of an insight into what some of that work is and where you think that's likely to go in the future.
Thanks, Graham. And hello to everybody. And before I say anything on that, can I just acknowledge that all of you are here late on a Friday night, and that many of you are dealing with really difficult circumstances about your own family and relatives and friends who are in Afghanistan, who are perhaps in very dangerous circumstances, and yet you're still out here trying to find ways to support and raise awareness and so forth. So I just want to acknowledge and thank all of you for carrying that torch and shouldering the burden of caring for people when they get here, as well as those who are still in Afghanistan. Can also thank Bilal and the Massoud Foundation for putting on this discussion. I really appreciate that as well. Look, the panel was established quite quickly by the Minister and actually the Prime Minister. He was pretty determined to have the panel established quite quickly as well. The panel is really established to provide advice around the settlement needs of people who are arriving, and in addition to that, the nature of the program, and also to look at ways of harnessing the incredible wider community support and interest in being a part of this exercise and assisting people from Afghanistan to settle here in Australia. They're the core areas that the panel has been working on. It's also important to say what it doesn't do. It doesn't make decisions. It's not a decision-making body. It doesn't have the authority to determine who would come or get a visa, which groups would be prioritised from which regions or any of that. There's been some misinformation about that, or perhaps a lack of information originally to clarify that. But I just want people to understand it's not a decision-making body and it doesn't determine those issues. Those issues will always be determined by government and they won't let go of that for obvious reasons. Some of the areas that we've been focusing on, can I also say the panel's been meeting very regularly, virtually every week, sometimes twice a week. But the panel is only one form of receiving input into this process. So we're conducting national consultations, state and territory-based consultations. There's consultations with state and territory ministers, officials. I'm participating in meetings and consultations with smaller groups every single day. I've lost count of how many they are, and all of that information is being collated and shared with the minister and the department to try to make sure the voices of as many people as possible are filtered in. You would have heard there was announcements yesterday about a package of additional settlement support. Well, that package was formulated in part through the advice of panel members who were also bringing in the concerns and the issues for the community. But a lot of that came from those wider consultations that I was talking about as well. So we're able to listen to what was being said broadly, bring that into a process, and as a result, it's yielded some pretty good outcomes in many respects. There's $27.1 million. And I don't know if you want me to go into that now, Graham, or a bit later. So I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah,
Okay.
let's come back to that, because I think there were two parts of that announcement that were very important. And the package, I think, was obviously very significant. I think the other part of the announcement was around what was going to happen to the people who were evacuated here under the 449 temporary visa, and the commitment that they would be on a pathway to permanency. I might go to you, Paul, if you want to talk about how you understand that will happen and perhaps the implications of that, particularly around the broader commitment of the 3,000 that Bilal spoke about, and what impact that might have on the humanitarian program per se.
Yeah, I mean, I think the announcement yesterday, or probably one of the surprising aspects in terms of a positive impact that I wasn't anticipating, was that it sent a much clearer message that the government was always intending to make the temporary humanitarian stay visas permanent visas, or give people the opportunity to apply, an expectation that everyone who came on those visas would apply. Now, I had always understood that would be the case, but I'm realising that in terms of the material that people received in black and white, it clearly stated that a temporary humanitarian stay was a temporary visa and that you could only apply for a permanent visa if the minister permitted that to happen. But of course, what wasn't known or widely understood was that the minister always intended that to happen. And I think one of the important parts of the package yesterday was legal assistance to help people go through the process of applying for a refugee and humanitarian visa or another appropriate permanent visa. In terms of where those numbers will fit in the program, I mean, as has already been noted, the Prime Minister has committed to at least 3,000 visas for Afghan nationals as part of the refugee and humanitarian program. Of course, as we know, this is a program that was cut from 18,750 in total to 13,750 last year. And it's also fairly clear from the indications from the government that those who are evacuated and will be applying for humanitarian visas will be separate to that 3,000, but within the 13,750 program so far. And yeah, I mean, we've certainly been making the case with many others for a special intake. You referred earlier, Graham, to the generous programs being put forward by Canada and the United States, 40,000 in Canada, and the United States, there will be many tens of thousands of visas ultimately. And, we certainly feel that Australia can do more and really, in fact, needs to, because the need is just so overwhelming. I mean, we've already spoken about the probably 120,000 or so. There's been about 26,000 visa applications so far, including, with multiple people in many applications. About 120,000 people have applied just in a matter of months for visas from Afghanistan. So it's important that Australia's program is as large as it possibly can be. And there's, of course, compelling arguments which we and others have made. And one of the things which we're actually also drawing attention to is the fact that a lot of visas have been lost in recent times. And in fact, if I could just ask for a slide that I had prepared, I'll just quickly share the numbers that have disappeared from the refugee and humanitarian program. 2019, when the federal government announced its budget, each year when they announce a budget, they specify what's going to happen in the next 12 months, but they also forecast what will happen over 4 years. And as of the middle of 2019, the program was 18,750 places a year. So the government actually was setting aside funds for 75,000 refugee and humanitarian visas up to 2023. Since then, or since the beginning of last year, the government has made a decision in last year's budget that it would reduce the annual program by 5,000 a year. So out of that original 75,000, 15,000 visas were taken out. And we've also had visas not issued because of the COVID pandemic. So the government stopped issuing visas in March 2020 and didn't resume until later in 2020, but certainly hasn't been issuing them at anywhere near the rate, even for a smaller program. So in total, when you look at the 15,000 that were taken out of the program, at least 11,500, and that's a generous underestimate, at least 11,500 visas not being issued. 26,500 visas over 4 years have disappeared just since the beginning of last year. So just to come back to the key point, that the common request that's coming from many people in Australia, including the Refugee Council, for a special intake of 20,000 is actually a very modest ask in the light of the fact that at the beginning of last year, 26,500 more visas were planned to be issued by the government. So there's a real opportunity for the government to restore those numbers and apply them to the needs of refugees from Afghanistan, while also not forgetting about very significant refugee needs in other parts of the world related to the crises in Syria and Iraq and Myanmar and in Eastern and Central Africa.
I mean, that need has obviously been echoed by the community and by organisations like Amnesty and others. So I think it is something that is definitely being put to the government and to the minister, we hope. I'll go back to you first, Paratho, in terms of the package and what it does. I mean, Paul mentioned the legal support. You've mentioned the figure, I think it was 27 million. What else will the package do then for people? It's mainly for those who are here, isn't it? It's for those who have already arrived.
It's targeted at the evacuees, but the way in which it's structured, others will be able to benefit from it. And it is over the next 2 years, so there will be other people resettled during that time that should be able to benefit as well. And that's in addition to the humanitarian settlement program resources already other sets funding that exists, some additional bits of funding around volunteer coordination and encouraging business support and so forth. Can I just also say, though, about the panel, Graham, that we do have views that we're expressing reflecting community sentiment about the scale and the structure of the program. I know there's been calls for 20,000 places. I'm not sure why we're stuck on 20,000 places. My view is that we should have a longer term program that is bigger than that. And that's certainly my view of it. I'm not sure. I think we got stuck through the Canada saying initially 20,000 and then the UK saying 20,000. It was only after that that they said it would be over 5 years. And then Canada hasn't put a time frame on their 40,000 places either. So my view is that Australia is in a position and has got a history of doing more, and we should be able to do more. So that's certainly what people on the panel have been expressing on behalf of the community. The other thing I think it's really important to mention is there's another group here that's really impacted, and that's people who are on bridging visas, on TPVs and on SHEV visas. And panel members, particularly from the Afghan community, but Paul and myself and others as well, have been raising their needs and the issues related to their plight as well, and have been very faithful in the way in which they have ensured that those issues are represented in the discussions as well. So for those people who are in the group who are on TPVs and SHEVs, again, we're not a decision-making body, but you can be very confident that your Afghan colleagues on the panel and those of us, the others on the panel as well, are not forgetting about you either. We know it's a very difficult and painful time for many of you also. With the package, it was 27.1 million. We've covered the legal assistance, and yes, everybody will transfer from a temporary visa to a permanent visa. And some of the problems with the initial settlement has been connected to that, but it was the quickest way to get people out, and that was the highest priority at the time. And I think the government and the department did a very good job, even though we would all agree that there was some terrible miscalculations about what was happening in Afghanistan, and that crisis was something that could have been avoided if there was some different thinking earlier on. There is $8 million for Afghan community organisations and sets providers who are working with Afghan organisations. It's a really important thing. It's something that I've been advocating almost from the day the Prime Minister asked if I would get involved. The Afghan community is doing an extraordinary amount of work to care for and look after people. The community-led organisations are shouldering a lot of the burden and the responsibility, and we felt as though it was really important to provide some additional resources to those communities. So it's not going to be for any group, any NGO that all of a sudden decided we'd like to support the Afghan community because there's money there now. This will be for community-led Afghan groups or organisations that have had a very long track record in supporting Afghan community groups and working in partnership with them. So that 8 million is directed at that for those purposes. And the guidelines for that will come out very soon. And we're looking to get it out as quickly as possible. The other part of the package was 4.6 million, I think it was, for assistance with people around their economic participation. It's 4.8 million actually. And that is to work with people, provide support to people to get qualifications recognised, to become engaged with the industry or fields of work that they have worked in for all of their lives. You got to remember, a lot of people that have come through have good English language skills, have trained in lots of different areas. And one of the things we learnt with the Syrian and Iraqi intake was that we had surgeons and engineers and general practitioners and teachers and a whole lot of people like that who really were unable to capitalise on all their years of training and expertise because there wasn't targeted support for that. So that's what that 4.8 million is seeking to do. It's a new initiative, so we'll have to see how that goes. And the other bit is around mental health services, particularly around experiences of trauma. We know people were assaulted. We know there were some women that were raped in trying to get to the airport. People suffered crush injuries, cuts and lacerations as a result of being pressed up against razor wire. And we also know there was the horrific bombing there. But also the journey to the airport was deeply traumatising. And then that's complicated by the fact that they're here and they have family and loved ones that they're terrified about. So hopefully the assistance for legal services will help them also lodge a family reunion application for people that have been left behind. The mental health services is really picking up on what Mooria's lovely and insightful presentation was about. We know it's a strong community. It's a magnificent community. And we know, in fact, most refugee communities are real survivors. But also there are deep traumas that people carry. And if you think about the established Afghan community, many who had put aside historical experiences of trauma, this conflict has lifted the lid on that. And there's this huge rush of those memories and thoughts. It's impacting on children at school in all sorts of different contexts. So the funding for mental health care is to help strengthen the capability there. And I can tell you from my own organisation's point of view, it'll be looking to invest in the Afghan community organisations as well, so that we're able to do co-joint work together, pay the organisations for the support that they're going to put into it, as opposed to expecting them to do it on top of everything else. So that's the total package. It's based on an assessment of what the initial primary needs were and a way of trying to get those primary needs met. And so hopefully we'll be able to come together and do that over the coming couple of years. I suspect this isn't the last of it. There'll be other things that will need to be addressed, and there'll be ways of taking that into other processes in the future for further funding.
Brilliant. No, thanks for that, Paris. And I do want to go back to a couple of the things that you said, particularly around TPV and Chev, and then with that, concerns about family reunion. And as we also have mentioned, to date, there's already been 26,000 applications, over 120,000 people for 3,000 places that are currently on the table. How has the discussions been going around priorities? We've got immediate family that's been split. We've got judges who are now fearing for their lives, LGBTQI plus people, others who have worked with various agencies who are now at immediate risk and are all reaching out to us, both in the community and organisations who are supporting them. How is that discussion going, and how do you think both Paul, Paris and Maria as well, the government should be focusing on those priorities? How do you think it's likely to play out? Or could it play out?
That work is being done at the moment, and hopefully the department will have provided the advice to the government and got a response from the government about how they're going to prioritise those applications. Can I just say, Graham, one of the biggest problems, the vast bulk of those 26,000 applications, not all of them, but the bulk of them, are really about sponsoring to get people out of Afghanistan. That's an unknown equation at the moment. No one has a diplomatic presence on the ground. We don't have a diplomatic presence on the ground. It's unclear whether the Taliban will allow processing or allow people to move out of the country freely if they are granted a visa. There are negotiations just last week in Doha around the provision of aid, and some of the G20 countries are making a prerequisite of receiving that aid, allowing the travel of people to leave Afghanistan freely if they want to. But we don't have a response from the Taliban yet really about that. So we have to wait and see. There are people who have got out in Pakistan, Tajikistan, some in Iran, some in India, some got out earlier and are in Turkey. So there may be ways in which existing applications for people who are in those situations may be able to be processed more quickly. But the greatest area of stress for people are for those who are in Afghanistan. And the reality is, and it's the bit that keeps me awake every night, is we still don't have an answer on how we can get people out safely. So that's a real challenge that I do know the government is alive to, and that particularly the 5 countries, Australia, US, Canada, New Zealand, are in regular dialogue and consultation about. So hopefully the situation on the ground will become clearer sooner. With TPV's
Paul,
shareholders... Oh, no, we'll go to Paul.
Yeah, I mean, I think the case for many more visas is really compelling. And when you think of what needs to occur, a number of things need to be happening simultaneously. We need to be doing everything that we can in partnership with other countries to be providing ways for those at greatest risk to get out of Afghanistan. We also need to ensure that countries such as Pakistan, Iran and Tajikistan are prepared to keep their borders open for people who are able to get to the border. And through that, for that, we really need to be offering resettlement and humanitarian assistance to those countries so that they know that if they're prepared to facilitate safe passage of Afghan nationals at risk, that they're not going to be left with the full responsibility and the rest of the world doing nothing. So I think that's important. I think there's also opportunities to facilitate access to other visas outside the refugee and humanitarian program for Afghans with qualification, to look at moving more quickly on a new model of community sponsorship, which is more inclusive and more affordable. There's lots of interest in Australia and both within the Afghan community and well beyond for people to get involved in that. And also, facilitating family reunion and also while doing that, addressing the terrible situation for those who've come by boat who've in effect been excluded from family reunion. So there are so many things that need to be done simultaneously, and I think Australia needs to be doing a bit of each of those things, but we can only do that with a greater commitment of visa numbers. So I think the fundamental question is how many refugee and humanitarian visas will be available, and also will there be potentially more inclusive access to other forms of visas for Afghan nationals. And we're certainly strongly advocating for that.
I wanted to ask you about family reunion, and obviously you touched on family in your presentation, but from what you're hearing from the community, I mean, how are they seeing Australia's response, and what are they telling you about what they think Australia should be doing?
So it's to me? Sorry.
Yes, to you. Sorry, Nooria. Yeah.
Sorry. Obviously, actually, Afghan, as I mentioned before, their collective culture. So our family doesn't mean just our nuclear family. So it's all extended family, and everyone is included. And one of the worst, one of the worst impact of this thing, like this current crisis on Afghans, was this seeing their family members are caught in Afghanistan. So that's why they're really concerned about family members, and they wanted to have obviously they want to Australia take kind of bigger stand on this, and there is a lot of campaigns from Afghan community. They want action for Afghanistan to increase the number of intake of refugees from Afghanistan, but also to facilitate the process. As Paul in Paris said, one of the most difficult thing is that Afghans are stuck inside Afghanistan. Some people can't even move from their houses if they're in high risk. So how they can go out or even make it to the airport. So that's why it has to, some sort of negotiation has to happen in terms of kind of negotiating and talking with neighboring countries, because even those who can make, because Afghanistan is a very mountainous country, people can make their way through different ways with the help of smugglers. They can get out, but they're driven back from Pakistan, Iran, or Tajikistan, so they don't let them unless we have some sort of deal with them, and then that they will allow us. But at the same time, to speed up the process, because refugees, like I worked 6 years in refugee camps as a medical doctor in Afghanistan. There were people that from a year to 20 years on that time that they were in camp. So like, we don't want this to happen to this recent crisis. So just an action needs to be speed up and kind of act quickly. And one of the question that was raised, because in the past we had a bit more generous offer in terms of intake of refugees when it was international crisis. So one of the questions that sometimes I hear from Afghan community, that they say, why 3,000? Is it because Afghans are Muslim? Like, because 99% Afghans are Muslim. So they're questioning this as well, whether this has to do with this. But I'm sure there's other reasons for it. So it's a really kind of main source of stress, but also expectation of the community is high in this regard. That's why they're what's the reason that they're keep saying 20,000, because they think that it's impossible that Australian government will increase more than 20,000. So in their head, because Canada initially accepted 20,000 in England offered 20,000, they think at least they can go there. That's why they're not asking more. But in reality, they would have loved to have more. But this is because it's just, they think it's impossible to go further than that, because 3,000 from our normal quota is nothing, actually. It's just like 3,000 people. I mean, they could have been accepted anyway, regardless of the circumstances, on their own merits, regardless of the current circumstances. So that's why it's a lot of anger and frustration amongst Afghan community in this aspect. And I'm sure Paris knows this, because he's meeting with every different ethnic groups from all around Australia, and that's the reason, because they want to have more intake here.
Yeah.
Graham,
I think we've only got a couple of minutes left. So Paris, you've got 1 minute, and then Paul 1 minute to give
Graham,
your
this
thoughts.
question of 3,000 needs to be kind of understood. It's in fact a lot more than that. I mean, I've heard ministers say that if they can push it to 5, they'll push it to 5. In this year, that is on top of the 3,500 people that were evacuated and settled in Australia. So if it achieves that in a year, then we're talking about 8,000 to 9,000 people, or 7,000 to 8,000 people in a year. Even when Canada said 20,000, it was going to be by December 2022. Or 3. It was 2. It had a 2-year time frame. I don't know why we've communicated like this, with the 3,000 being the floor and not the ceiling, because I don't think people quite understand what that means. But the aim is to push it as high. My personal view, though, is that we should be looking at a long-term, sustained, significant program that is in addition to the humanitarian program, and as Paul says, picks up on other opportunities. If someone is skilled and has the expertise that they would have qualified under another visa category, like a business visa or a regional sponsorship visa, but there's just some tweaking that needs to be done around the language skills part of the application or whatever, or criteria, then why take a refugee place up with that when we can give them one of those other places? So I think if we think cleverly and smartly about this, we should be able to have a sustained program over a long period of time. But regardless of that, we will still get above that. My last point, Graham, is that we also still have to care about the Burmese communities, the Syrian and Iraqi communities, the Ethiopian communities, South Sudanese. They're also really important. But a distinguishing factor here is that this has never happened before. An Australian government hasn't singled out, other than perhaps the Vietnamese, a community group that it would establish an advisory panel with, would have a rolling series of non-stop consultations across the country with the community, has a dedicated notion in their program for that the challenge for us is to harness this opportunity collectively, to put aside whatever differences there may be that exist, and to focus on how we can bring this together in a way that benefits as many people as possible across the spectrum. That's a responsibility we all have. It's one that I have been prepared to take on and hopefully won't fail at. I hope other people and organisations are prepared to do the same thing, because I think there is something a bit historic about the way the government has talked about this issue.
Yeah, no, thanks, Paris. Paul, you've got 30 seconds for final thoughts, if that's okay.
Well, yeah, no. Well, our greatest hope will be that the immigration minister will say the 20,000 special intake was too conservative, and the government's prepared to offer more. I think what's remarkable is the extent of support, across the Australian community. The Christian churches, which are very, very divided. If you're outside of the Christian world, you may not realise the extent of the divisions within Christianity. But they've had the broadest range of Christian churches come together. And also people may have seen that 57 New South Wales state MPs from 7 different political parties, all of whom hate each other, got together and co-signed a letter to the federal government asking for a special intake. So we've got, a lot of community support, behind communities. And I think if we just keep the pressure up and keep putting forward constructive and positive ideas, we may actually get, a much larger number, which is of visa places, which is so desperately needed.
Terrific. Look, I wish we could have longer. Your collective knowledge on this is quite something, and I hope people have got a lot out of this, because to get this panel together, I think, was a real credit to the Massoud Foundation, and I really appreciate the thoughts you've all provided tonight. It's been really enlightening, I think, and it's not over yet. We have a final presentation, final thoughts from Shakufa Tahiri. So over to you, Shakufa, for your final thoughts. But once again, thank you all for your presentations tonight.
Thanks, Graham.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for such a robust discussion. And I think it was really great to provide clarification, but also conversation and discussion that the Afghan community in particular has been looking really forward to. I really want to thank you for engaging so well with the Afghan community and being such good allies. So everybody on the panel. I think it's wonderful to hear that obviously the government has announced the support package to settle Afghans who have arrived in Australia over the next 2 years. And the multi-faceted support, and I think in some way unprecedented in the types of support that will be provided, especially the one with, especially the really generous support that will be provided to community-led organizations that will have a really great role. Obviously, communities and community organizations have always had a very close and critical role in settling their own communities. And it's really clear why, because I think that the degree of support and the understanding, the empathy, and the fact that these are, Afghan communities who are arriving in Australia are part of the existing communities, and they're part of the same diaspora. So it's easy to understand why the support to the communities are really, really important. I think that in light of the crisis that has happened in Afghanistan, Australian government, my view is that the response has to be proportionate, and especially in light of the historical engagement. It is the most historical engagement that Australia has had in the past century, really in any nation. And so more needs to be done without obviously communities feeling abandoned at this very critical time. It is a moral duty, but also the right thing to do at this time. And this includes, like Paul echoed and like the rest of the panel echoed, to at least a 20K separate intake, matching sort of the other nations around the world, like Canada, that is now committed to 40,000 refugees and as a separate intake. And obviously, we don't know the details in terms of the increments, but I think that it really shows that the communities are not feeling abandoned, at least in those countries. And I hope that Australian government can actually match up and be proportionate in our responses. And of course, as panel members, we are trying to amplify the community voices, and we know that there is a huge support out in the broader community beyond the Afghan community. And Paul mentioned the church groups have supported the Afghan cause in an unprecedented way. And it's really great. We feel very moralized, I think, as Afghan communities because of the support that exists, and we hope that Australian government can use that. And of course, it goes without saying that the Australian government can further, expedite the grant of family reunification channels, and particularly, lifting the bar by removing Direction 80, and that has been the call widespread. And we know how difficult that is making the lives of many Afghan families. And of course, the only type of protection is a permanent protection. We hope that the government can work towards that to make that happen, because I think it's been, nearly a decade that we have desperate families and desperate individuals who are in limbo, and it's the right time. And if this is in the right time, then what could be the right time in such a huge crisis? And be rest assured, the advisory panel, who I also have the pleasure to be part of, are amplifying these voices of the Afghan communities, but also the broader Australian community. For Afghan diaspora communities in Australia, we will continue to echo your voices. I think that that's the most important thing for us, a voice that's united and is very clear and clarified. And of course, this is, and I think it's been really, really, really great. And I emphasize that the discussions have been really constructive. The collaboration with the government has been really, really great. Of course, I've been part of it, and I haven't really seen any sort of platform that has been given to community-based individuals really to be part of such an important dialogue with the government. We hope that we have an outcome that's that's positive. So of course, for our non-Afghan audience here watching us, we really thank you for keeping engaged in the discussions about Afghanistan. We really hope that you do keep engaged about Afghanistan and the issues that's coming out of Afghanistan, but also be in touch with Afghan communities here in Australia. The crisis in Afghanistan did not end with the airport crisis ending. Afghanistan, that was just a glimpse of what really is happening in Afghanistan. The crisis didn't end with Taliban lashing women protesters and sending them. It continues. Human rights abuses keep happening in Afghanistan, and we obviously understand that the media cycle is over on a lot of those violations of really basic rights. But I as a diaspora member, as an individual who has families and communities in Afghanistan, those abuses continue, especially for the vulnerable groups, minority groups, the previously persecuted groups, any groups that really dissent what Taliban really stands for, and the barbarity that with which they want to govern a country and millions of people. So that we really hope that you stay engaged. And finally, I really want to thank the speakers and the organizers, Massoud Foundation in particular, but also we really appreciate the support of Amnesty International Australia and STARTS. Thank you so much for being with us, and we hope that we have more panels. But at this stage, I really want to thank you for joining us. You have a really great evening. Thank you all.